Hey, welcome to Pusher and another install video featuring our Powerflow Intake System, which consists of our intake manifold and turbo inlet. As always, these install videos are meant to be an additional guide to our instructions that come with every single product we make. If you don't know much about these yet, we have an overview video which covers all the features and benefits and why your truck needs them. Go check that out if you need to learn more about it. But today I'm going to go right to the install. And so the first step that I always go to is I go through my parts list. Our products all come with full instructions with a parts list on the front. And so I've gone through and I've made sure before I remove a single nut or bolt of the truck that I have everything I need to finish the install. And so I have all that, I'm ready to go. Let's get this thing started. So the first thing we're actually gonna do to the truck is drain some coolant. And that is because the factory intake manifold does this big kind of curlicue thing that I talked about in the overview video. And it's really tough. I actually haven't figured out how to get it kind of rotated out of the way without removing my upper radiator hose here. Fortunately, these trucks are super easy to get coolant out of. There's a petcock right on the lower corner of the driver's side of the radiator. 5-gallon bucket fits underneath there. Just turn the petcock, let it start draining. Make sure you remove your radiator cap so it drains faster. And so I start that so that by time I'm actually to where I need to remove the manifold, I have about 2 gallons of coolant out of the motor. We only need to get basically what's in the upper radiator hose and at that level out of the motor. And so I've already done that, so you guys don't have to listen to coolant drain into a bucket during the first half of this video. So the next step is going to be starting with removing our secondary portion, like the cold air here. We'll move on to our EGR inlet tube and then pull our map sensor all off in one go. So next step for removal is your hot and cold side charge tubes. The hot side, not really required to remove, but it makes a lot of room. It only takes me about 3 minutes to get it off, so I'm gonna pull it off as well. So first off, I like to remove this worm drive clamp here. And I like to pull the coupler off the intercooler. The older these trucks get, the more these couplers stick on. This truck's pretty young, so it wasn't stuck yet. And next we're gonna move to our C-clip down here. You basically need to expand each side to get it out of the groove. And then you push forward a little bit and off. On the cold side, it's pretty much the same routine. I'm gonna move the clamp off the intercooler. Pull our tube off. Now we can come up to our throttle valve adapter here. It has a big C-clip on it. Just expand that off and around. You can take your intake air temp sensor and give it about 1/3 of a turn to the left. Pull that out. And this throttle valve adapter just pulls off the throttle valve. You can pull your whole charge tube out. Now we want to take our throttle valve off in an effort just to make this intake manifold as small as possible when we get to finally removing it. So the throttle valve has 4 bolts, and then it's also plugged in to the harness here. A lot of the factory plugs have a little safety clip here that you need to slide out first, and then you can push in your clip like a normal plug and slide it out. You don't necessarily need to use a screwdriver to do that, but I wanted to do that so you guys could see. Now we need to pull off our CCV hose before we remove anything else. And so it has a little twist lock connector underneath this piece of shrink wrap. And so if you kind of pull back on the shrink wrap, you don't want to squeeze it. You just want to try to pull it back off the connector and get access to it. Now your connector has a little bit of a rotating barrel out here with 3 clips on it. And you can see as an interlocking tab, 3 of them actually all the way around here. You need to pull that tab this direction and then rotate the barrel that direction. You see how I've rotated it out of the notch there? And you can pull it off. And that just basically disengages these little tabs that fall into the groove down here. Now I need to take my large hardware off the front of the manifold and the turbo inlet. We're actually going to save one of these bolts for later use, so make sure you set those aside. So the last little bit of hardware we need to get to is our flange bolts. There's 4 on the driver's side flange here, actually one shared with the dipstick tube, and there's actually a dipstick tube mount there on the back. And then there's 4 over here on the passenger side as well. And then lastly, there's a hose clamp on the compressor inlet. It's kind of down. We can't really see that well on camera, but pretty accessible from that side. And so this hardware really just comes down to how you access it to what tools you have, whether you have ratchet wrenches, you know, what's length extensions, short, long sockets. It's got to find the kind of combo that reaches each bolt and get them out of there. Now, there is probably like 1/4 teaspoon of coolant left in here that just didn't make it to the weep hole on the thermostat. I like to just shove a paper towel down in there. I like to remove this housing, which is why I'm doing this. If you have a truck with a lot of miles or is older and you're worried about the condition of the thermostat and are doing this at a time when you can't go buy a new one, like late at night or something, then you may want to consider that before you remove the housing, because it does seal the thermostat to the motor. But again, if you need one, it's probably time to replace it anyway. So this truck's young, I'm not worried about that. I'm just trying to keep everything as clean as possible when I do disassembly. So there's just 3 bolts that hold that guy on. And so you can see there, I have no coolant really falling out, so it's gonna be really easy to clean up what little bit is left. And that way, when I go and start this truck again, if I see any coolant, right away I'm gonna know I have a leak. Now we are finally ready to remove these guys. You would think the intake manifold would come off first since it's above the turbo inlet, but that's not the case. We actually have to get the turbo inlet out first. I've gone and I make sure all my harness is unclipped and pull these little clips out of the upper coolant hoses here, one off the fan shroud here, just to give myself as much room to work as possible. I also went ahead and unclipped my coolant temp sensor here, just because it's kind of right where this manifold is going to rotate over. I just don't want to damage the harness if I can avoid it. So it's a very specific method here. And so what needs to happen is the manifold needs to kind of come up and rotate 45 degrees counterclockwise. And so simultaneously, my driver's side flange needs to go backwards, my passenger side flange needs to kind of come up and rotate over this coolant tube here. And so meanwhile, my turbo inlet kind of needs to move with me. So I'm just going to kind of wiggle it off the front of the turbo here. And so driver's side flange is moving backwards, passenger side flange is coming up. And it's going to rotate over 45 like that. And so now turbo inlet can come out. I'm going to remove that rubber bushing later as well. And then my manifold can go ahead and come out as well. So now the fun part begins. And the beauty of this setup is you can install it and uninstall it any way you want, which is awesome for working on the truck, maintaining, diagnosing stuff in the future. And so I'm gonna go turbo inlet first. And so you probably have noticed a couple things here. I have taken the bubble wrap that my parts will come in when they're shipped to you, and I've laid them out on the bench, which is great, especially when I go to the intake manifold and I start putting gaskets and the map sensor in and all that. So that protects your parts. Turbo inlet doesn't really need any prep, it just goes right onto the truck. And then a quick note here is, this is all the hardware you should have saved. I talked about it during disassembly, but just to recap, we have one of the turbo inlet bolts, our 4 EGR inlet bolts, map sensor, dipstick tube bolt. So we will reuse those pretty much entirely when we go put the manifold on. So let's go ahead and get this turbo inlet put on. The only thing prep-wise really is across the board, anytime I put any of our silicone couplers on, hit them with a little silicone spray. This is the blaster stuff from Home Depot or anywhere standard. And that just helps so much when you're like doing your kind of final assembly and adjustments and stuff. Everything slides around really nicely. And so let's go ahead and carry this guy over. We got our 2 clamps that are going with the coupler, 2 M8 bolts and washers, and then our turbo inlet. First step for the turbo inlet is to install our coupler. I like to have my drives on the worm side, over here on the passenger side pointing straight up. I think you have better access there. And then our coupler is going to be oriented so it's just bending and coming straight up like that. And slide that clamp down into place. And then we're going to take our turbo inlet. It's going to go in so that your crankcase ventilation ports on the driver's side, and obviously your oval is going to be facing forward. You're basically just going to push it down until your bolt holes here align with your thermostat bridge where the old turbo inlet used to mount. And we'll put in your 2 bolts loosely for now. You can get to them pretty easy later, and so I like to put them in just to get this thing aligned, and then we'll throw the manifold in next. Now we can prep our intake manifold to go in. First up, I'm going to install the map sensor using the little button head M6 bolt here. Just going to slide that in the hole, line up with the threaded hole. And pre-install our O-rings in the machined O-ring grooves. And then I like to take my hardware for the 2 rear flange bolt holes in each flange and set them in there. And so I go in, and this thing pretty much goes straight in, a lot easier than the factory one does. And you can set it right down there on top of the motor. If you see, the bolts can't come out of there. You do that at your own risk. I've never dropped a bolt in the motor or anything like that. It's very convenient for me to do it. A little trick I like to do, but that's up to you whether you want to do it or not. Now the moment we've all been waiting for, we're going to go ahead and set our intake manifold in place. I want to note real quick that I have no hardware, no tools, no nothing up here. It does overhang the motor pretty far, but I just take my precaution to make sure nothing can fall down in, because you can see our 2 cylinder head openings are facing directly up. So I got my hardware on the back. This is going to go in the exact same way the factory manifold did come out, but in reverse obviously. So your driver's side flange is going to go in first, and then we're just going to rotate over and into the passenger side. So I'll move my dipstick tube out of the way with my right hand. And one thing you can do just to ensure that you're lined up good is throw a bolt in this front flange here. And then I like to take the aluminum spacer included in the kit. That's going to go underneath this front bracket right here, and it's going to line up with this boss that the factory intake manifold bolted to. And this is where that turbo inlet bolt you saved is going to come into play. So that's going to go through all of that. So just getting all this kind of started now is going to help you with that back hardware. When you go in to thread it in, it's going to kind of pre-align those back holes to make it a lot easier for messing with that hardware when you can't really see it. Now that our manifold's lined up, we can just go in and start placing the remainder of our flange hardware. You can see I got some tools up here now. My holes in the motor are all covered. I don't have to really worry about tools and stuff falling into the motor. I'm going to go around and set all this stuff. And what I always recommend doing on these is torquing your at least three easiest flange bolts to get to. So over here on this passenger side, I have the 2 front and the 1 in the back on this side. Those are pretty easy to get to and torque down. Those are going to compress my O-ring all the way down, and then I only have to touch my back corner bolt that I feel like is the hardest to get to just torque it. Same with this guy. These all 4 are pretty easy, but I like to hit my 3 that are easiest, get the thing torqued down, and then when I torque that back corner one, whatever one's hardest, it's not really going to affect the torque of the other 3. Once those 8 are done, I'll tighten my bolt up here at the front of the intake manifold. I'll tighten my 2 here on the turbo inlet bracket, and then my hose clamps on the turbo inlet coupler. Also, this manifold opens up a little bit of room here to get over and down and grab some of that hardware over the stock one. Talking about that particular area, don't forget to plug in your map sensor once you're done torquing the hardware. Next up, we're going to install our throttle valve on the manifold. I have my new gasket placed here. They're pretty cool. They have little like tangs onto the opposite bolt holes that'll lock the hardware in. You want to make sure that your sealing surface on this throttle valve is really clean. The older these trucks get, the kind of nastier the throttle valves will get, so make sure you clean that off before you put the gasket in. It's going to just go in the exact same orientation it came off. I'm just going to finish up tidying this area while I'm here. Put our thermostat housing back on. And clip in our crankcase ventilation hose. Plug our coolant temp sensor back in. And the throttle valve. I'm going to go ahead and finish up my install now on this side. I'm going to start with your EGR inlet tube. Our kit comes with new gaskets for it with tangs on them that'll help hold it on the flange. I like to bend my tangs a little bit past 90 so that it really stays in place on the tube. And that just helps when you go in to sit this thing in place. And so now we're actually going to flip this thing 180 from the direction it was in the truck. It was this way. From the factory, we're going to flip it this way to where the bend in the tube is closer to the EGR cooler side. Also, it's going to be hard for you to see once I put this in place. There's a little clip here on your EGT sensor that's going to go in the third hole on our turbo inlet bracket as well, and that's going to help to secure that the way it used to be on the factory turbo inlet. And so to secure this guy to the motor, we're just going to reuse the last little bit of hardware that we kept, which is the 4 bolts that used to secure it to the engine. Last step over here is our cold air tube. Make sure you snap in your coolant lines there. Okay, so obviously the last steps would be putting on your cold and hot side charge tubes and then your upper radiator hose. I'm going to take advantage of the situation. I'm going to upgrade now to ours. The factory ones have proven to be extremely problematic, and I don't want to subject myself to the odds of being left on the side of the road. If you haven't seen it already, there's a full install video on them, so I'm just going to bang these things out real quick. That's it, we're done bolting on parts. I've gone over and rechecked every bolt, every nut, every clamp, every sensor. They're all where they need to be, they're all secure. And so we've effectively eliminated by far the biggest restriction in the system with our new intake manifold, which flows right at 66% better than factory. Our turbo inlet also brings another 15% to the table over the factory unit. We've eliminated our chance of failure with our cold and hot side charge tubes there. This truck is ready to log a lot of efficient, reliable miles going forward. The only thing I need to do now is add coolant back to the system. And so if your truck had the appropriate amount of coolant in it to begin with, you're not going to be able to add all of it back. You'll probably have about a quart extra, and that's because you're going to have some air trapped underneath the thermostat and some other spots, but no big deal. As soon as that thermostat cycles the first time, you'll be able to add the rest of the coolant in and you'll be good to go. So we add a ton of information to the site continuously. If this video did not answer all the questions you have, go check out the site, see if you can find the answer there. If you can't, we're here for you. Shoot us an email, give us a call, and thanks for watching.